the Israel-Hamas war, which started on 7th of October last year. Your thoughts on the fact that it's been going on for 100 days. What do you have to say about that?
I think this is extremely worrying, not to mention depressing. Of course, we have to take this in the long frame of history. This is a conflict that has been going on for many decades. But in recent flare-ups, one has hoped that it would die down again in a couple of months. And in fact, quite the opposite is happening. It's getting worse and worse, and we're seeing more countries being dragged into this. If we actually look at the map, we can see what's happening here. We have Israel completely encircled by countries that comprise parts of Iran's so-called axis of resistance. And this is not going to be easy to put back in a box. Each of those countries, this is not just Gaza to the west of Israel with Hamas, but Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon, Shi'i-backed militias to the east in Iraq and the northeast in Syria, and of course the Houthis in Yemen to the south. Each of these players could be gradually ramped up, dragging in more Western reactions. So I think things are very worrying indeed.
You know, you've talked about the axis of resistance, and you've talked about Iran. What is their game plan? You know, like you rightly pointed out, it is encircling, it has encircled Israel. What do you think is their game plan? What is the end that they're hoping to achieve in this war?
I think Iran was very unhappy at the expansion of the Abraham Accords, these agreements with Arab regimes with Israel to make peace. And it looked like Saudi Arabia might be about to also enter the Abraham Accords. So something had to be done. Of course, Iran's intention has been publicly stated the annihilation of Israel. So the last thing they want is for the Arab world and the Muslim world to start to come to terms with Israel. And at the same time, Iran has hankered for many decades after hegemony, greater control inside the Middle East, inside the Muslim world specifically. It's a Shi'i-based regime, and it has coveted the control, the power of Saudi Arabia, a Sunni-based regime. Now, if you can't change the religion of Sunnis to Shi'ism, which obviously you can't, then the next best card to play in order to win over populations is going to be Palestine, which is still an issue that arouses great empathy and sympathy amongst the Arab street.
Do you think that the Ukraine-Russian war also had any impact on any of the decision-making of this?
That's an excellent question. If you look at the broader geopolitics, then yes, the disruption more generally in the world and the balance of power and the international rules-based order is under great threat at the moment. So this was good timing by Iran and its partners. Of course, we should say that Iran says it didn't have forewarning of these attacks, but certainly it looks like there was a plan afoot. This works incredibly well for powers like Russia, like China, not just Iran, who would love to distract America from its support of Ukraine against Russia. This is just one more front to tangle up the United States and to show before the world that the United States is acting like world police and impacting the sovereignty of other nations. This plays to those kinds of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian narratives.
Now have to come to the Houthis because, you know, you have written about how they're really affecting global trade. India also has come out with its own report saying that we will be seeing the impact, if not already, and everybody is feeling the impact of the Red Sea attacks by the Houthis. Who are these people, Elizabeth? Let's start by addressing that.
The Houthis are a group that emerged in the northwest of Yemen. Now, they're a religious group, a military group, a political group, all at the same time. They take their name from their former leader, Hussein al-Houthi. who was killed in 2004, and their current leader has the same name. He's one of his brothers, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. But they're much more than just a tribe. Their religious base is really important because it informs their politics. They are a branch of Shiism called Zaydism. And that's important because, of course, they have this Shiism in common with Iran as fellow minorities within the Islamic world. And, of course, their political arm is actually called Ansar Allah, which means partisans, supporters of God. So that shows how closely entwined their politics is with their religion. Now, I should just mention that when they began to mobilize back in the 1980s and in the 1990s, they began a movement called the Believing Youth. This was in response to what they saw as their marginalization, religiously, economically, politically, and they had quite a bit of sympathy. But since then, their ambitions have grown, and it's about much more than simply fighting back against marginalization. Now they have ambitions to extend their authority really over the whole of Yemen.
And what is it that they want from these disruptions?
So the Houthis share with Iran and Hezbollah and others on the so-called axis of resistance of Iran a desire to see Israel not just contained, but annihilated. Their slogan, the Houthi slogan, is death to America, death to Israel, a curse on the Jews, and victory to Islam. That's very similar to the slogans of Iran and its partners. And so now is a great opportunity for them to start living up to their slogan. Now, I don't think, however, that we should see this as completely opportunistic on their part. There's a genuine belief that they'd like to do this. That said, politically, their motives are to increase their popularity, not just with their base, which is, of course, very tired after nearly a decade of civil war in Yemen, but also more broadly in Yemen and around the Arab world. There's great sympathy for the Palestinian cause, and there don't seem to be a whole lot of people standing up for Palestine. So the Houthis have won themselves a lot of support. And beyond that, the Houthis also have other elements to gain from their actions in the Red Sea. On a regional level, they increase their leverage with Saudi Arabia, Saudi is trying to extract itself from the Yemen war at the moment, and seeing this antagonistic neighbor to its south, it doesn't want to annoy it further, so it's getting more concessions. It's giving more concessions to the Houthis. And then finally, internationally, well, the Houthis gain massive publicity, both for themselves and for the Palestinian cause, and they ensure that the rest of the world feels some of the pain of Israel's actions in Gaza. These are just the kinds of events in the region that could tip matters over into a much broader war. So the Houthis clearly want to show that the US and UK strikes have not impacted their ability to operate, and more importantly, have not scared them, have not dented their fervor for war. And I think the Houthis will have been prepared for US and UK strikes, not just prepared in terms of hiding some of their equipment and also preparing for follow-up attacks. They will have been hoping for it because it proves everything that they've been saying about America as an imperial power trying to launch a war on Islam. This is how they are framing it. And they now have some evidence for that, as they would see it. And of course, they're used to suffering airstrikes. They suffered over 25,000 airstrikes from the Saudi-led coalition during their civil war, and it didn't stop them. And they're hardened fighters. They've managed to keep at bay some of the Middle East's most high spenders on defense for the last 8 and a bit years. That's the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And they haven't given up. So worth remembering here is that the Houthis do not need to be accurate like the US and the UK need to be accurate in their strikes. The Houthis simply need to keep launching missiles, out into the Red Sea at anything, because that is enough to disrupt shipping and to rattle financial markets and to therefore have knock-on effects around the rest of the world.
It's amazing how a small force, since they're well armed, that's what I'm calling them, is holding the entire world to ransom. But when you see that in contrast with a superpower like US, taking them on, how do you see this playing out? Because we've seen what happened to US in Afghanistan, and then they had to pull out, in another say. You think they would be able to limit or counter them, because they have tried all sorts of things, have been tried earlier, right? So how do you see, first of all, the US, and how do you see them in an election year of theirs as they're sort of going down? How do you think that is going to play out in the US?
Yes, these are all excellent questions. It is an unequal war. You're right that if the US were to unleash its entire military might against the Houthis, then that would be an existential problem for the Houthis. They would not be able to survive. But the Houthis and their supporter Iran knows that the US is not able to do that, because launching another full-scale war with boots on the ground in another Islamic country in an election year is simply not a smart idea. It would go down very badly in the region with the United States as allies, and it wouldn't go down well at home, because, as you say, their track record in the Middle East has been one of huge expense and reputationally quite damaging. They retreated from Afghanistan rather shambolically, and they didn't fare that much better in Iraq. So it's very unlikely that they'll be able to launch a full-scale war against the Houthis now in Yemen. And of course, the Houthis know that. So all they need to keep doing is goading the United States, launching their missiles back, and keeping the United States occupied, and possibly hoping that the US might be tempted to enter into a war that will mire it down and prove probably quite unsuccessful and expensive, both in terms of finance and in terms of reputation.
How is this going to impact Europe and UK specifically? Because they've launched this whole Operation Prosperity Guardian, and they have formed the US and the allies are there. But there's also the Ukraine war impact that's happening. Then we've seen the rise of the right that's happening in some of the countries in Europe. How's all of this going to impact Europe and UK as UK is also going into its election years?
I think the impact on us won't be obviously nearly as bad as the impact inside the region, and that is probably part of our calculations. And you can see how the UK and the US believed that they could not sit by and do nothing whilst these attacks were being launched in the Red Sea by the Houthis. On the other hand, they also look weak now, because having done something, having launched airstrikes, and having had those not be successful, the Houthis are still able to launch attacks. That also makes them look weak. So we're in quite a dilemma here. And I don't think that there's any end in sight to the Houthis' attacks in the Red Sea. In fact, they might well continue and use this as an opportunity to start up their domestic war again. Now, if that happens, then who's going to be blamed? It will probably be the West for launching their attacks on the Houthis and provoking them into a new cycle of war. So, in short, what does this mean for us? It means possibly a new cycle of war in the Middle East. That will occupy our bandwidth, make us less able to concentrate on other areas like Ukraine. And it will also be expensive for us economically, both to continue on several fronts at the same time, and because of the knock-on effects on the global economy from continued disruption in the Red Sea. So any way you look at this, it looks bad.
Last question, do you think the world order has changed?
I think the world order is in the process of changing. And I think it's clear now that the US and the UK and Europe are losing traction amongst their allies inside the Middle East, and perhaps more broadly in Asia. This is a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. It's very difficult to wake up one morning and say, it has changed. But you can see how powers like Russia and China are starting to shape the global narrative of turning the West into the enemy and the aggressor. And that will seep in, helped along by new kinds of technologies, social media, and strategies of misinformation and disinformation. So this is an inflection point, I think, in the global balance of power. I think we're seeing a shift.